If anyone's on the line, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're located. I think we've got quite a number of people now jumping on, guys. So thank you for joining us. We're probably going to be, I'm just looking at the time now, about 3 or 4 minutes away from the actual start time. Typically, we try to give people an extra couple of minutes to join us between now and when we kick off. So just some housekeeping for our webinar tonight. We're going to be taking as many questions as we possibly can. You'll notice that there's an opportunity for you to ask questions in the chat. What I'll try to do along the way is really try to make sure that we answer questions where and how they come up. If I don't get to your question initially, I'll try to make sure we get to all questions at the back of the webinar as well. So please hold out if there's any urgent questions. I think there's an option to put your hand up for anything that might be pressing as well. There's going to be a very special one-time offer at the back end of this webinar that we're pretty excited to announce also, so make sure you stick around to the back end because that's really where we're going to allow all of our webinar listeners the opportunity to get an exclusive option that we haven't had prior and haven't been able to give away prior. So yeah, really excited to be able to deliver this information tonight as we've been working on this for about 3 or 4 months and dragged out some pretty amazing data from previous cycles, right from Perth to Adelaide and everywhere across the middle of the country over towards the East Coast. So we'll just sit tight for a couple of minutes, letting everyone else join onto the webinar. Yeah, make sure you get somewhere comfy, get a pen and pad handy if you do need to take notes. We are going to hopefully be able to record the webinar in the background as well. So what we'll try to do is send out a recording tomorrow so you can rewatch or send it on to anyone who didn't get a chance to watch it as well. So make sure you get a chance to look into that at some stage. But yeah, we'll sit tight just for a couple of minutes as we've got a lot of participants joining. And thanks again for taking the time out on a Thursday evening. Hopefully anyone with kids, friends and family who've got kids to put to bed, that's all happened and done. So I know I've had to go home, get the kids dressed, fed and showered and put to bed before I got back into the office to get things done. So I sympathise with anyone going through those motions at the moment as well. So we'll just hold tight for a couple of minutes before everyone joins on. So apologies for the dead air. All right, guys, well, we're right on official starting time at the moment, and part of that is as I said, we just want to make sure that we've got as many people got the opportunity to jump on as possible. We've got a couple of people who've noted they'll be a couple of minutes late, and that's fine. We'll try to make sure we're starting pretty much on time at this stage. So to ensure that we get right into it, and I think anyone who's obviously registered for the webinar have noted that what today's webinar is really going to be focused on is in the light of a lot of things that are sort of all coming to the crescendo at the moment, in light of Sydney prices declining anywhere between 9 and 13% over the last 18 months, Melbourne prices declining anywhere between 7 and 10% over the last 18 months, and some markets such as Hobart exponentially skyrocketing by 8 to 9% in that exact same time. Brisbane probably by 2 or 3, potentially 4 to 5%, depending on where you hold. Adelaide probably 2 to 4% as well. Perth is still coming off, but probably finding somewhere in that bottom of the market. Canberra still going ahead in a nice, slow, steady pace, and Darwin and a couple of other small markets are probably seeing some other issues with regards to their economy and supply. But I think realistically, what we wanted to bring to light today is that more so what has happened over the last 10, 20, 30, and even in some cases 40 years, and where we could scrape together as much data as we could across our major markets to actually be able to bring everyone a bit of an understanding about what's happened in the past as opposed to what's happening right now, and what's happened at certain times when markets have gone up exponentially, they've flattened, and in some cases come off the boil to some degree, sometimes within a matter of months, also in years, how long those times take to hit the bottom, and then also from there how long they take to actually come back to a growth market or even a market that's finding its equilibrium. So we're going to share a lot of information about all these markets and how we get through them all. So bear with us as we've got a whole bunch of information to share with us, guys. Quick disclaimer, which is quite obvious for everyone, just to make sure that we're all aware. None of this is specific financial advice, and obviously it's quite general, but if you do need to consider your personal position and appropriateness, make sure you engage a financial or property investment professional. That's enough of that. So quick one before we get into it, guys. Just want to make sure everyone's aware of who is Pure Property Investment if you're not aware already. As buyers agents and buyers advocates, as well as investment property strategists, we represent the buyer in the investment process, as well as buying people's own homes. Our research, industry relationships, as well as our negotiation skills and our sheer size of our team really allow us to separate us from the crowd, in the sense that it's allowed us to actually become really pretty much pioneers in our industry, and that's allowed us to be winners or recipients of numerous awards. Most notably, we're the Optus Property Company of the Year award winner. We've also been nominated as finalists for numerous other industry awards. I personally sit on the board of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, or PIPA for short, and we've also been noted as one of the top buyers agents as Your Investment Property only a couple of months ago. So we've won a couple of accolades on the way, and really our mission is to employ zero compromise on what we offer for our clients, and that's right from our initial conversation through our strategy, right through to understanding every client's individual and unique needs, to take them right through that investment property journey, or ultimately even buying their own home, to make sure they get the adequate and exact outcome that fits their position, as opposed to just buying whatever's available that fits the exact top of their budget, which is something we most certainly do not do. I personally probably do a fair bit of work out in the open media, and things such as Sky News, the Fin Review, realestate.com, Domain, Smart Property Investment Show, as well as other areas. We've recently done a few different podcasts with some other industry professionals, and I've just launched a book. So we'll be on the project in a couple of weeks rather, and a lot of the other major mainstream channels for promotion for our book. Just a quick plug, it's the Surfer's Journal to Property Investing, and how to live your life on your terms. Ultimately, you'll see all the book information come out pretty soon, and hopefully we'll be able to give out a few advanced copies to our database in the next few weeks as that all comes to fruition, which is quite exciting for us. Enough about that, however. So what are we going to cover? And for me, that's probably obviously why you're all here, is we're going to cover the state of the markets and where each market sits right now, where we expect, we'll talk about at the end, where we expect the markets to be heading over the next 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, and try to give a bit of an understanding and barometer of where we're going to see opportunity to make money, where we're going to see opportunities to stay out of markets or potentially hold in markets which are going sideways or backwards. We're going to talk specifically about Sydney and Melbourne, and specifically how much further we think it might have to fall, and when the opportune time to probably buy in each of those markets may well fare. Also going to look at some holistic data on Sydney and Melbourne in particular, to make sure people get a bit more confidence in those markets, to note that what is happening right now is most certainly, in my opinion, back in April 2017, I called it to say that I think that the extra, injection of an interest rate cut from what happened in the banks at that time really fueled a bit more into the fire that really didn't need to be investigated or ultimately fueled up. There was an opportunity there to really cap where that market was going. And I think from that point in time, it was actually going to be probably something where we saw the opportunity to put the brakes on the Sydney and Melbourne markets, but nonetheless, we'll cover that. From there, we're going to talk about where we're headed for the next 3 years and beyond, and which markets are going to give you a strong ROI over the next 3 years, in particular in that small time frame. The bonus offer, which is only available to our webinar subscribers, we're going to target towards the end. But before we get into any of that, what I want to cover right now, and also probably just before I touch on this, is making sure that everyone who is on our webinar at the moment has the ability to make sure you put your hand up, and you also have any questions that we can make sure they get answered. We've got our team in the background who are ready to make sure that those questions come to myself, and we'll try to answer those on the way. So if you do have a question, make sure it's loud and clear, type it into the Q&A, and we'll make sure that gets listened to. But from the first slide I really want to take on and target is what's happening across the market in general. And this is a slide that I've used previously, and it's a slide that I think is quite important to understand what's happening and what's affecting the current housing market right now. So it's a fair bit of information on one slide, but I think it really depicts a couple of really important factors. And whilst previous housing cycles have generally been dictated by changes in the interest rates, the current slowdown has really quite been very much dramatically influenced by restriction in credit as opposed to the actual price of credit. And I was speaking to Ben Kingsley only recently, and I know he noted on his podcast, I think only last week, that really where the main squeeze that we're seeing in the restriction in people to buy property, both investments and owner-occupiers, and what's restricting the ability to buy property at the moment is not necessarily the interest-only versus principal and interest availabilities out there, or the price of money, or the Royal Commission, or negative gearing changes. It's ultimately coming down to serviceability and how banks have changed the ultimate serviceability of where money can be available for any borrowers at the moment. And that's something that we see will probably be a short-lived point in time. One aspect in particular, though, which I think would be something that's adhered to and absorbed probably a lot more for the medium and potentially longer term, is our income or our personal spendings as a household, where probably on average previous to APRA restrictions and changes, we were probably being assessed on a household spend of about $2,500 a month, where in reality, the averages are probably more like $4,100 to $4,500 a month. And that's now what's being adhered to for anyone who wants to go and apply for a loan. And that's effectively $20,000 to $30,000, possibly $40,000 difference in what the bank sees that you actually spend per year difference. So ultimately, if you're earning $100,000 of your household, you all of a sudden now only qualify for potentially $70,000 of actual physical money that is going to be available after your household spending that comes in, which previously might have been capped at $100,000. So you can see pretty quickly that that's about a third of the total amount of money that you earn per year that's taken into account for your serviceability. Now, not to go too deep into that, because that's not really the intention of tonight's event, but really what I wanted to make sure we understood is that it's not necessarily a huge supply issue. It's not an economic issue. It's not necessarily going to be certain markets that are going to be spotty as far as too much or in excess of 5, 6, 7% interest rates, which are now affecting serviceability. It's ultimately that crunch of the availability of credit, which we do believe probably in the next 6 to 12 months is going to find a plateau and then start to soften a little bit as well. So to touch on that too, guys, what I wanted to probably go back in time a little bit on here is to look at post-GFC housing market conditions and how they've been heavily skewed towards Sydney and Melbourne. And we start to now see the media jump on the bandwagon of, well, because Sydney and Melbourne have come off the boil with regards to property price growth, that all of a sudden the whole Australian market is painted with the same brush. It really isn't the case. And this graph, it more clearly depicts every one of the major markets, more or less, and how they've grown over the last 10 years, and really showing that they've decoupled. And more or less every market other than Sydney and Melbourne have effectively, and if we look at what's here in the grey, we're looking at the regional, and if we're looking at what's in the blue, these are the major markets. But quite clearly, the two markets which are the recipients, and this has come off a little bit since this data was released, but it's probably more like 70-ish%, give or take, for every market. Over the last 10 years, they've both grown. But outside of that, markets such as Hobart and Canberra are probably only really two other markets that have shown anything above the inflation number for growth over the last decade. So every other market is probably a little bit more in a position where there's probably opportunity from a longer term growth perspective at this point in the cycle, as opposed to seeing that it's a national issue. And ultimately, the affordability and price points along with yields are very, very different across all of those markets. And we're going to get into that a little bit more, but I think it's a very poignant slide to actually start with. So we're going to start specifically in Sydney and probably give a bit more confidence in anyone who's got investments in Sydney that they're thinking about potentially doing something with, holding, selling, what's in store for the future. And going back to that initial discussion that I had about the availability of credit being the main issue, which is what we're facing with regards to where we see the Sydney and Melbourne markets going backwards at the moment. But the Greater Sydney economy in the last 12 months added 118,000 jobs, and that's adjusted for November 2018's data, showing unemployment at around about a bit over 4% for the first time in effectively more than 10 years in Sydney alone. And the reason why that's important is that as much as we're not necessarily seeing wage growth, which is an issue, we are seeing employment at a rate of knots, and there is strong employment, and there is a very, very big infrastructure pipeline in Sydney in particular, and parts of Brisbane, parts of Melbourne in certain pockets. But more so, if I look at Sydney, the infrastructure pipeline and the jobs creation of that pipeline is not a 2, 3, 4-year pipeline. It's a 10 and 15-year pipeline. So there is a lot of jobs consistently to be planned and foiled for the next 10, 15 years and beyond. So employment's going to be steady. overseas migration is also quite steady. But I think one big thing is to note is that we don't have a jobs issue right now. We have a wage growth issue, but that's not a jobs issue. So jobs are fine. And housing affordability, going back to the more national picture, is much less of an issue across other cities than Sydney and Melbourne. And this is probably a couple of slides here that I wanted to focus on to note that really a couple of big indicators we look at as investment property buyers agencies: dwelling price to income ratio. And ultimately, when we're looking at markets which have got anything above around about six times, we look at them to say that, look, it probably more like 6.5 times. We look at it to say, look, it's probably fully priced, and really not necessarily fully priced in the sense that people can't afford to pay more. But when we go back to the serviceability issues that we spoke about earlier, one of the big things that comes into play is that if banks aren't lending more money, then people can't pay more. Even if there's more demand, ultimately, if we find that there's a ceiling into where the actual amount of money that's going to be lent from the banks, people can't ultimately pay more. And when we get up to around about 6.5 or touch above 6.5 price to income ratio, 6.5 times price to income ratio, we start to see that as a bit of a cap or restriction. And you can see quite clearly there in that graph that Sydney sits at 9.3, Melbourne sits at 8.0. Look, that is a bit old, that data, but that's probably seasonally adjusted. Is going to be sitting at around about 8.4 and about 7.6% for, or 7.6 times for Melbourne. So they're still way above where we see the comfort levels. And you can see quite clearly that if we look at Sydney and Melbourne back in, I guess the GFC, around pre and post GFC, it was sitting at around about 6.5 times. So it was probably much more in that affordability position where we saw there was still opportunity, but it's pushed way beyond those. One thing that's clear though is that every other market, as we've already depicted, sits well below that. Adelaide's probably a touch above. Brisbane is a little bit more. Hobart's actually increased a bit since then because it's actually been on a pretty steady growth trajectory. It sits at about 6.5, 6.6 times income to price ratio now, and we're seeing it's definitely fully priced. But other markets such as Canberra, markets such as Darwin has a supply issue as opposed to the actual income issue. And then you've got areas such as Perth and Brisbane sitting in really quite a meaty curve. Over to the right-hand side of this slide, a couple of things that I wanted to note on this slide again as well is that the percentage of annual gross household income to service an 80% LVR mortgage versus or in all capital cities. And again, you can see that the trend is very, very clear that it's Sydney and Melbourne sitting right at the top there. And anyone who's on this webinar, and I dare say it's most, who have a mortgage and potentially multiple investment property mortgages, you can understand that if you've got a mortgage that is your principal place of residence and you're responsible for making those repayments, then you've got Sydney sitting at almost half of all income has to be directed straight towards paying the mortgage. Melbourne sits at about, pretty close to $4 out of every 10 goes to the mortgage. Everywhere else sits between probably $2.50 to $3 out of every $10 you earn goes towards the mortgage, which is, for us, anything that sits again below about $3.50 out of every 10 that goes towards paying the mortgage, or ultimately 30 to 35%. That's still within a comfort level. And we're seeing that people are being able to service loans as well as live a normal life and ultimately longer term pay more for property. And that's the key for price growth when you've got all the other factors such as supply, economic growth, as well as areas which are going to be restricted over the long term, backfill opportunities, etc. If people can afford to pay more, ultimately that is what's going to happen. But Sydney and Melbourne, quite clearly, we're sitting well above that. And these two graphs really dictate that quite seamlessly to say that here's the reason why we're probably going to the point of a retrace, which is going to happen for some time until we get to the point where they're affordable again. Guys, again, if there's any questions, feel free to jump in. I might not be able to answer them on the fly, but make sure they sit there and I'll try to get to them along the way. Going to this next slide, the forecasted housing starts, and this is a big one that we look at for supply over the coming 3 to 4 years, in conjunction with a steady net overseas migration, will be returning probably to the market to a supply deficit rather than increase in, and will result in increase in rents. And the two big things there is that we're seeing continued amount of migration, both international and in certain areas. We're seeing domestic immigration rather from certain cities to others, and we're starting to see some more influence in certain cities that are starting to see some very, very heavy domestic migration, which is pushing up demand in the early stages. But also, one of the big ones, and anyone who is buying, and anyone on the webinar who's bought an off-the-plan unit in Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane in the last 1, 2, 3 or 4 years, would have noted that there was probably a distinct issue with regards to the amount of properties which were being developed, particularly in the multi-density high-rise apartments. And they're the areas which we personally didn't touch and avoided and haven't bought a single one. However, we've seen that that's particularly where the most hurt is. In particularly probably 2 or 3 years ago in Brisbane, parts of Sydney are now only just seeing those issues. Parts of Melbourne have probably gone through some of those issues over the last 10 years in patchy areas. But one thing's for clear, or for sure, and that is very, very clear, is that the forecasted construction housing starts is actually diminishing rapidly. And what that's going to therefore do is bring the supply back into equilibrium and start to put more emphasis on there being a much more subdued amount of stock for renters and also for owner-occupiers, and bring us much more to an equilibrium position. But you can see here that between 2015 and 2017, we had an unprecedented amount of dwellings constructed on 4 separate years, consecutively over 200,000 dwellings constructed year in, year out, almost adding 1 million dwellings in a matter of 4 years, which is the most that's ever happened on record. And we're coming right off that, and projections are going to be that we're going to be sort of sitting around that 180, 170, potentially down to 160 by 2022, 2023, if credit stays relatively hard to obtain. So that's a little bit about probably more so where we see the holistic picture. Sydney in particular, jobs creation looking good, but obviously supply and credit looking relatively subdued for the short period of time. Also looking at the overall housing commencements and starts over the next 3-4 years, and how that's probably going to come back more into equilibrium, and probably see that there's going to be more emphasis on demand where rents will come up. We'll start to see more emphasis on areas which are going to become more competed over from owner-occupiers and eventually down the track investors as those yields do come up. So working further down that track, with capital city dwelling values falling, and then mainly specifically here, Sydney and Melbourne, rents will continue to rise as gross rental yields are gradually recovering from record lows, which were probably occurring around about 1, 2, and 3 years ago, depending on which city you're in. Now, this is going to be a bit of a laggard, and this is one big thing and big indicator that we look at, is even though Sydney, for the most part of its growth cycle, and Melbourne, for the most part of its growth cycle over the last 4 to 5 years, they weren't necessarily markets where there was an enormous amount of demand, dwelling construction, probably more so in 2013, 14, 15. In fact, at that time, there was very little. There's probably been more development in the last 2 years compared to the last 7 years put together. But what there was is that there was a lot more investor activity at that time. And what that meant was even existing dwellings, which were previously selling to owner-occupiers, were then selling to investors and turning them from a property which wasn't on the rental market to then a property that goes on the rental market. So actually increased supply quite dramatically, even though they weren't increasing the overall amount of dwellings that were available. So we saw that that's really skewed different markets, different times. And some of the key areas which you'll see in this graph, which are very, very evident, and this is probably more of a picture of late 2018, as opposed to probably where it was 2 or 3 years prior. To give some examples, we were buying in Sydney back in 2010, 2011, 2012, where we were picking up yields of 5.5%, 6.5%, in some cases up to 7.5% in parts of southwest Sydney, parts of Wollongong, parts of Newcastle, where those equivalent properties, based on the price growth and the minimal amount of actual rental growth, are now sitting at about 3.8%, 4.5% gross rental yield in the exact same market for the exact same properties. So the opportunity was there. It's now passed, and it will come back, but it's going to take rent rises or rental growth to actually see that equilibrium come. If we look further afield, or more in the more recent past, rather, places like Hobart, which is now coming off the boil with regards to gross rental yield, we're buying in Hobart probably all the way through from about 3 years ago to about 18 months ago in particular. And in that particular time, even still now, look, there's still markets there where you can definitely pick up 6.5% rental yield assets with less than 1.5% vacancy rates. However, on those markets, we saw that there was an opportunity at that point in time. And that point in time is probably now diminishing as you see that growth is coming to those markets. So for us, it's really to say that gross rental yields from the combined capital cities is really a market that probably holistically is sitting a bit lower than where it was pre-GFC. But now we're sort of starting to see that on an upward trajectory, and we expect that in this time of tighter credit, you're going to start to see rental increases right across the board. In particular, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth right now, we're seeing those markets. Hobart's gone through an absolute tear as far as rental growth is concerned. In some areas, you've seen rental growth in excess of 30-35% the last 3 years. We think that's going to become a little bit more subdued as there's a bit more investor activity towards the back end, so more supply in the rental market, and a bit more of that population growth now being centred towards Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and a little bit more interstate migration now pushing back over into Perth, which is a good sign for their rental markets. But we probably expect that that's going to be a general theme as the actual capital growth market starts to plateau. We're going to see more emphasis on rents going up, and it's going to make it harder for tenants. People are going to have to pay more for rent in general in certain markets. Probably only real markets which are going to be a bit soft there are going to be those high-rise, high-density developments. They're still going to see quite a bit of softness over the next 2 or 3 years. And we probably see that some of those probably areas, and not to call it out for anyone who owns in these markets, but probably some of those really, really off-the-plan centric freestanding housing markets. I can think of a couple: Upper Coomera, Pimpama, probably in parts of Werribee in Melbourne, parts of, if I want to say in Sydney, probably out the back of Narellan, certain parts around the Badgerys Creek area. There was a lot of off the plans that sold to investors about 1 or 2 years ago, which is coming to fruition now. We're starting to see that there's a lot of stock, and there's going to be a lot of softness in that market for a short to medium period of time as well. But that, as a general theme, is something we expect to continue on. So going back to the housing demand picture, guys, and housing demand and migration to Australia, and this is a really confident picture for anyone who's thinking, well, where are we going to be going over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even up to 10 years, is that in general, the net overseas migration in the last 10 years has been the strongest it's ever been. And it's on a pretty steady trajectory where we're introducing around about, somewhere around about 1.8% of our total population is increasing per year migration. And that's seeing that in general, we're probably seeing somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people a year via our actual growth internally as a country, and then the overseas growth as well, somewhere in the vicinity of that coming in. We hit 25 million last year, and the expectation is that we're going to see that double within the next 25 years. So the migration as well as the growth of our population is going to be exponential, and we don't see anything that's going to stop that, because ultimately from a government's perspective, migration overseas, interstate migration, creates economic stimulus. And as much as we like to think that, yes, it does unfortunately pose problems for jobs creation, and we need to keep finding where to create these jobs, and it does actually probably soften the wage growth because there's more competition for the same jobs. It is going to mean that there is always going to be a demand for people to live somewhere. And that's something that I do take a lot of confidence and comfort in when I invest in property, is the fact that it is going to be a bare necessity, and it's going to be shelter that is needed. There is potentially going to be twice the amount of people in this country in the next 20 or 30 years as there is right now. And we're going to sit on an unprecedented level of consistent and continuous construction. As much as we might go through some peaks and troughs, there is going to be need for this ongoing, and it's not going to stop in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Housing affordability, I just want to touch on this one more time, and how housing affordability across Australia is the most diverged it has been in over a decade. And I did touch on a slide earlier to say that Sydney and Melbourne are well and truly decoupled from the rest of the markets. But one thing I wanted to note here quite clearly in this slide is that if you look back in the first red circle that I've noted here, is that just post-GFC, or during the GFC more so, most markets, as far as that ratio that I was speaking about the amount of household income or percentage of household income that was allocated towards mortgages, majority of just during and after the GFC was sitting pretty close to around about that 30, 25% in some cases. And then it's exponentially in certain markets, in particular Sydney, you've seen that it's hovering around about that 35, 40, in some cases really hovering above that 40% mark. Melbourne itself is also hovering quite high above that. And the other market that was sitting there, and because obviously these data are skewed by the amount of people that live in both Sydney and Melbourne, you can see that with the green line here, the darker green line is the actual national average trend line. And when you look at that, you start to see that again, it's very clear that Sydney and Melbourne, everyone is paying more as a percentage of their household income to actually repay their mortgages as compared to some of our other major markets, notably Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide, in our much, much bigger markets compared to places like Canberra and Hobart and Darwin. but it's very clear here that there is a distinct opportunity in these three markets that's starting to present, because people have been paying much less for their mortgages for a long period of time now. So this is a good thing for anyone who lives in those markets, is that theoretically they should have more ammunition and more ability to actually pay more for property, because therefore they should have ideally more savings and more ability to borrow more to go out and buy in those markets. Their economies, particularly in Brisbane, is now starting to really see some quality green shoots. Adelaide's got probably 5 years before it starts to see the full effect of a lot of the bigger announcements. And Perth now in the very early stages is starting to see some big economic benefit of the renaissance of their mining period as well. So opportunities do arise in those markets as we speak right now. So what we're going to do, guys, is we're going to take a trip down memory lane and go back a long time here. And we're going to look at some different markets right across the country and the previous downturns and how long they've been sustained and how long they took to get back up to growth markets in each of our major markets. So take some time with me here, but I'm going to go through these in particular. So starting with Perth, and we all know, or anyone who's been following the market for at least the last 5 years will know that Perth's been coming off the boil most likely since around about 2014 was where it saw itself top out, and it's actually been going in a backwards trajectory up until around about the last 6 months, where it's finding its bottom right now. And that's taken about 4.5 years to find the bottom. That's a very long, prolonged downward cycle, and one of the longest that Perth's ever had. And that's really been on the back of unprecedented development. But over recent years, Perth's experienced a number of downturns in the housing market. If we talk about the last 30 years, during 2008 and 2009, during the GFC, it was very short-lived, and you can see pretty clearly there in the yellow line that it resulted in overall falls and decline of about 11% in 13 months. So it was very quick, very sharp, and took some time to come back. But the current downturn, as I was saying, has seen values drop, not necessarily as much, but over a much longer period of time. So it's been a bit of a death by 1,000 cuts. And it's quantified into about 11% from peak to trough, which occurred in the peak occurred in 2014. And we see that they're probably starting to see some opportunities in that market. Again, going back to vacancy rates and also rental yields, we're probably seeing that there's opportunities starting to present. They're not necessarily everywhere just yet, but certain markets are starting to look a little bit more attractive. We're starting to see vacancy rates drop from upwards of 6% in certain areas down towards in areas right now below some cases 3%, which is starting to get into comfort territory for us to start to say that there is all the way from $300,000 markets right up to $700,000 markets where there is very good opportunity for that 2 to 3 year growth cycle. Hobart, the data in Hobart that we could grab probably doesn't go back as far as most other markets, but it does go back to around about 25 years ago. And if we look at that data, we're looking at it here, you can see that Hobart dwelling values are currently rising at a much faster pace than any other capital city in the country. We probably see that they're starting to really plateau right now. But nevertheless, Hobart's seen a number of periods over the past recent years which have led to very much deep and in some cases prolonged declines. The period of 2010 to 2012 saw the largest of these declines, and that was just after the GFC. Predominantly that was backed or based on the fact that tourists just weren't going there. And obviously we saw a very high Australian dollar compared to the US dollar at that time, and that really wasn't allowing for much of that tourism coming in, as opposed to us fleeing and getting the most out of our dollar at the time. But it declined by about 10 or 11% over 27 months. But following that 27-month decline in value, values took until 2016, or ultimately somewhere around about probably 5-6 years after the peak returned to its actual previous peak. So it was about a 7-year peak-to-peak time frame before it came down to the bottom. People who invested in Hobart between 2015-16, I know we bought probably in the vicinity of about 100 properties in that time frame in Hobart for clients and ourselves, probably have seen the best part of 50% growth since then. And on the back of that, vacancy rate sub 1%, and in that same time, probably somewhere in the vicinity of 6-7% gross rental yield. So really, really solid cash flow and exceptional capital growth. And predominantly those markets weren't the high-end markets. They weren't the markets of the battery points as such and the $1 million postcodes. They were more so in that $200,000 to $350,000 price bracket, in what I would say is more of that middle to working class markets of Glenorchy and right around that northwest area and across the bridge over towards Risdon Vale and even towards the more affordable markets of Bridgewater and Brighton, saw some very, very, very good opportunities that were seized by a lot of investors at that time. And I'm pretty pleased to say that we've got a lot of investors who managed to get a lot out of that time. And we see a few other markets now presenting, not necessarily in Hobart, but with really similar numbers, which is very exciting for us. Looking at Adelaide, going back to, again, the early to mid-90s, this is where we've got this powder at the moment. Over recent years, there's been a number of sustained downturns in Adelaide, but they haven't necessarily been very, very deep, but they have been quite slow and steady. And anyone who's on the webinar who's got property in Adelaide and has had it for a period of time will know that it's pretty predictable. It's been predictable for good and bad reasons. The good reasons is that you typically see that there's not necessarily a huge rate of downturn. There's usually not a huge rate of growth, and that's usually been over a 40-year time frame. That's been pretty much the story of Adelaide. There's been a couple of spikes over that time frame, but in the times where it's gone backwards for a relatively measurable amount as well. And deepest it went was back in 2010 to 2015, where it went backwards about 8% in that time. But it's now seen a nice, steady, sustained growth, and probably over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen some pretty good federal announcements of some big contracts over the next 10, 15, 20 years, which will probably put it in good stead. However, there is the fallout of the Holden plant closure and the flow on of all the other jobs that were affected by that. And we probably estimate that somewhere between 10 and 15,000 jobs, which were directly affected by the Holden plant closure in supporting businesses in and around the Adelaide area. So it's not necessarily to say it's boom time for Adelaide with $50-odd billion worth of subs and frigates contracts and probably somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 jobs, high-paying jobs coming to those markets, because there's probably about the equivalent that was lost over the previous 2 or 3 years. So they've got a bit of catch-up to do, but I think it's going to be relatively solid and steady over there with a half-decent yield in certain middle-tier markets as well. Canberra's been a very good one for us as far as a very predictable and quite good market over the last 3 or 4 years. However, if you go back in time, you'll see that there is most certainly areas and times where that predictability wasn't the case, and also the show that it's actually gone back quite severely at certain times. And probably you can see here from the graph that I'll go through the data in particular. Canberra witnessed a number of periods in which dwelling values have fallen over the years, but the greatest value decline was over about a 3-year period between 94 and 96, and values fell the best part of 15%, which is a pretty steep and pretty severe decline. Over 3 years, not necessarily a long period of time. You'll notice there's a pretty distinct trend here that the deepest declines usually are coming off the ball pretty quickly and usually coming back to equilibrium at the same pace. And usually that graph, you see that you can almost draw a triangle from start of decline to the point where it reaches equilibrium is all more or less going to be an equilateral triangle on that end. And it's very, very obvious on a lot of these different peaks and troughs. But one thing that we did note in that downturn was that there was a lot of unemployment that came from the downturn of a big layoff in public sector work, and also a big addition of actual supply at that same time, which are usually the two worst things that can happen together, which is jobs becoming affected and supply becoming increased at the same time. And that's what Perth saw and has seen for the last 6 or 7 years, which is probably why it's seen such a sustained and long period of decline. But I guess looking further afield, probably the only real areas we see issues with in Canberra at the moment is in particular the attached dwelling markets, and there's probably a little bit of oversupply there right across the board, but predominantly in that inner and middle ring sectors where we don't necessarily like those markets. Yields are quite soft. Vacancy rates are very, very good right across Canberra. However, the supply is a little bit of an issue in that attached market. So the detached markets are quite attractive. However, the price points and the entry levels are also quite expensive. So we're talking in the vicinity of 500 to 700 is probably where that meaty curve sits, but your yields are probably going to be more like 4.2, 4.6, 4.8% at best. So you've got to make sure that you've got some cash reserves and buffers in place, because that's realistically going to affect your personal cash flow by about $5,000 to $8,000 a year, just to keep that in mind. So moving on to some of our bigger markets, so we'll start with Brisbane, and Brisbane's been an interesting one. Anyone who's invested in Brisbane, I personally have got quite a number of properties in Brisbane myself, and I know a lot of our clients have had access and have been investing there quite actively over the last few months and years. But although Brisbane dwelling values have currently do sit at their peak, which a lot of people don't necessarily know, there have been 4 recent periods of decline, and the largest of which was just after the 2000, well, sort of just before and just after the 2011 floods, and that saw dwelling values fall by about 10.5%, 11% from their peak. What this graph doesn't show is that there was a huge run up between around about 2006 and 2009, where Brisbane went up by about 70% in that 3.5 year time frame. So it did see a very, very strong growth period just before the 2010 cycle, and that was coinciding with the GFC, the mining downturn, tourism dollar faded away as the Aussie dollar was increased over $1 to the US. And also at that time, we saw the floods, obviously, but it came off the back of a lot of growth prior to, and a fair bit of supply that was built at the back end. That being said, we're probably seeing some markets now in Brisbane which are probably sitting much, much more appropriate to opportunity for growth based on a few things, one of which is interstate migration. It's probably seeing the highest level of interstate migration out of any of the major cities at the moment. And data will suggest that's been the case for about 18 months now. In addition to that, they're seeing their economy is starting to really ramp up and starting to see the effect of some consistent government and a lot more investing in local infrastructure, both within the Brisbane and the surrounding markets, but also some major larger markets that go up towards things like the Adani coal mine, which looks like it's going to, or the Carmichael mine rather, the Adani centre that's going to be running that. That could be a very big stimulus for areas up in that mid to upper North Brisbane areas, or North Queensland areas rather. One thing I would note, and we're seeing that's probably also a level of comfort for us within areas of Brisbane, probably not necessarily the Gold Coast, but also the Sunshine Coast right now, is vacancy rates have probably come off a peak where we saw the construction peak was around about 2015-16 for Brisbane. That's now cut right off, and they're probably building less than half the amount of dwellings they were 3 years ago, which is a good thing for supply. And also what that's doing now is taking their vacancy rates from a peak of about 3.1% down to about 2.7, 2.6, in some cases 2.5% and below. So we're starting to put a little bit of pressure on rent, and that's a consistent thing that we'll probably expect over the next 3, 4, 5 years, is a bit more pressure on rent, to therefore increase those values over that same time. And we're probably going to see attention from owner-occupiers and investors, and a very steady growth market over that time. One thing I would note before I get into Melbourne is, in particular in parts of Brisbane, in particular when we're talking about that, is that those areas where we're seeing really good opportunities, probably parts of where we see opportunity for infill rather than just fringe and buying or right on the fringes because they're affordable and good cash flow. Still in those similar markets, but closer to the main infrastructure. So where the existing train lines sit, where the existing hospitals, the existing schools, and all the other employment sectors sit. I know it's not rocket science or brain surgery for anyone on the webinar, but in particular in those areas, once you start to dig a little bit deeper and understand the aspects about where the rezoning has taken place, where the actual flood-free and easement-free markets sit, and where the actual local councils, the local governments are really trying to influence developers to come and create high density, they're the blocks which are still quite affordable, providing decent yields. But also at the same time, right now, I think there's a distinct time and opportunity where for the next 2 or 3 years, there's going to be an opportunity to hold and look at that as a 10, 15, 20-year play. But just word to the wise on that one, we see some really good opportunities in those backfill markets in that $300,000 to $500,000 price point as well. So taking us to the two major markets, in particular starting with Melbourne, I'm going to got a couple of extra slides for Melbourne and Sydney, just to take us back to GFC, just so we can get a bit more understanding about the actual macro markets in both Melbourne and Sydney. But Melbourne over recent years has seen 6 periods of sustained downturn, and this might surprise a lot of people. When it's only now that we're starting to see Sydney go backwards, with people 3 or 4 years ago saying, well, Sydney's a bulletproof market, you buy there, you wait, and you're going to do well. Well, to a degree, yes, but look, I tell you what, there's plenty of people I've seen who have lost a lot of money and are a lot of hurt right now, who probably bought aimlessly and not necessarily for lack of a better term, too smartly in the last 1.5 to 2 years, who are now reaping what they sow ultimately. But this data goes back to the best part of 30 years in Melbourne. And if we look at it over that time, these 6 to 10 times where it's gone backwards, the longest was during our recession ultimately. And that was where we saw interest rates in Melbourne. And you'll see the Sydney graph that comes up in a little bit, which is really quite similar, where we saw very, very high interest rates in excess of 15%. We saw the economy in a slump, and it was prolonged. And we're talking somewhere in the vicinity of peak to peak, seeing that time frame take somewhere in the vicinity of around about 5 or 6 years. And that was a very, very prolonged period of time where there was actually really good opportunity buying. If you look at this graph, probably between somewhere around about, probably about 1993, 1994 was a very, very good time to buy, even though it was probably pretty close to the bottom of the Melbourne market. It was an extremely opportunistic time to buy in that Melbourne market. And anyone who's held property in that market for that time or bought in around that time will know someone who has. Well, no doubt too that one of their biggest regrets is they didn't buy more when they could have at that period of time, because really it was ramping up for a much more sustainable city with longer term jobs creation, a lot more population growth, which has just been consistent for the last 25 years. And now seeing that also touching on the other markets or other times in that market where it went backwards was in particular, and you'll start to see that in the black line here, and I apologise guys that this black line is not necessarily showing current data, where this line is actually traced down towards probably where that grey line sits now, where we're about 15 months in, and it's about probably at the same depth at about that, just before that 10% mark. But we're seeing it's about there. Now, we don't expect it to do a big V shape and come back up to growth within the next 6 months. We probably expect that to see that bottom hold for probably somewhere between 12, 18, potentially 24 months before we start to see a bit of that supply as well as that rental growth come in, and also that price correct itself to get a little bit more affordable, especially in those middle and outer markets where we want to see a lot more of the opportunities for renters to go in there, put some more demand on the supply, bring up the rental values. And ultimately, that's what's happening. Is there's a lot less supply being built now than what there was 2 or 3 years ago, but it takes time. But the opportunities, I would say quite clearly, are probably going to be in around about that 2 or 3 year time frame, where it's probably going to be the ideal time to look at striking there. But again, it's still going to be a high price point, irrespective of how far down it goes. It's still going to be higher than the national average, and rental yields are still going to be softer than the national averages. So you still have to be able to make sure you can afford to hold the property through those lower cash flow cycles, and it's still going to be there, and similar to Sydney. This is the second slide I had on the Melbourne downturn post the GFC. And I just wanted to note that this was how far backwards in that GFC timeframe, in particular when we break it down to some certain suburbs, that each of these different markets went backwards. And you can see quite clearly here that, and this slide is very different to the Sydney slide, which I'll show in a second, that areas that you would potentially think were going to go backwards further actually weren't that affected. In Melbourne in particular, the more affordable markets actually fared the best in that downturn of the GFC. And that's exactly what's happening in the current market, is that the more affordable suburbs in Melbourne are actually doing fine. They're maybe come off the boil 1, 2, 3, 4%, but they're the markets which obviously the price points were a little bit lower, or a lot lower to start with. Investors who bought there still had decent yields. They could afford to hold in those softer times. They didn't lose their cool, and they didn't say, well, it's time for me to get out. So they actually thought, well, that's the time to hold. But those areas which were much more exclusive, and also areas which were lifestyle areas such as the Mornington Peninsula, they saw some of the biggest price reductions, in particular, in some cases up to 15, 16%. So there has been a time, and only literally 10 years ago, where that market in some areas has gone backwards in excess of 15%. So it's not unprecedented what's happened now, or what's happening now rather. And look, it's not going to be unprecedented when it goes back through a growth cycle and everyone's going back on the bandwagon of property's too unaffordable, we need to do something about it. But it's just a good slide to make sure that we all remember what's happened in the past, in particular why it's happened in certain areas and what's going to happen the next time it goes around. So if we drill down a little bit to Sydney now, and contrary to popular belief, back to what I was saying earlier, about people thinking that certain investors, not necessarily all investors, but certain investors thinking that Sydney's always been a bulletproof market, but there's been a very, very distinct number of periods where Sydney's gone through a decline over the last best part of 40 years. And the greatest recorded fall was between 88 and 91, where values fell around about 11.6%. Look, the reality is that we're going to beat that record in this downturn. We're just about there, if not already there. We probably expect that this downturn from peak to trough is probably going to be somewhere between 16 and 18%. And we're probably about another 3 to 5% away from achieving that. And we expect that we're probably going to find that bottom of our market somewhere between July and potentially towards October of this year. Post-election, post-washout, and those opportunities really are going to start to see them flatten out from that point there. One thing I will note, though, which is very, very obvious in all of the downturns, is that it's almost every single downturn has taken exactly the same amount of time within a couple of months for most of these downturns to find the bottom as it has to get back to where it starts to find equilibrium. And if we hypothesize that we're about 18 months into the downturn now, We might be another 6 months before we find the sheer bottom of that. So let's say it's about 2 years. We expect it to be about 2 years before the market actually starts growing again, or being in a position to actually start growing again or not going backwards. So anyone who's thinking about Sydney, firstly, going through any other issues other than which I spoke about earlier, strong population growth, very, very good economic numbers and economic data showing that the actual infrastructure spend over the next 10, 15, 20 years is looking exceptional. It's most likely going to be the best economic time we've had holistically for a very, very long time, specifically in the construction and the government sector, as there is a multitude of different opportunities that are coming from there. Retail is probably the only real shaky ground that we're seeing at the moment on the back of what's happened over the last 3 to 6 months. But we probably expect cheaper money to come towards the back end of this year. So we expect an interest rate cut, if not two, by the end of this year, start of next. And what that's going to mean also is that we're going to see the ability at the back end of this year to see probably around about circa 2015, 2016 prices. So more or less a Sydney sider towards the back end of 2019 is going to be able to buy the equivalent property that they could have bought at 2015 at the same price. That's a good thing. And this is going to give investors, and speaking personally as an investor, we haven't bought in Sydney since 2013. And we saw tremendous opportunity back then, but we also saw an opportunity to say that the market's getting a little bit hot, and our opportunity was to take and then also to release and make sure we weren't in that market. And very similar to Melbourne, we stopped buying in Melbourne around about 2015, is that we saw the opportunities probably pass us, and that we want to make sure we're in the markets once they're in their growth cycle, but we really don't want to be buying at the top end or the heated end of that growth cycle. And go back to Melbourne as another market, that's an obvious one. We were buying there 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, but stopped buying there tactically on the most part, other than a couple of off-market specials, up until about 18 months ago. And in that time, look, that market's gone up 50%, but we probably see that it's pretty close to the top. And really, once it's hitting that top, we probably expect it to find some wavy territory for the next 3 to 5 years. The good thing about Hobart, which is a little bit different to these markets, is that cash flow is actually exceptional. It still is exceptional. Vacancy rates are still very, very low. Where the back end of this current cycle in Sydney, we're seeing that supply is probably the biggest back end issue that's now come off it. And it's not because they've necessarily built an awful lot, but at the peak, we had about 60% of all properties transacted in around about 2016, 17 were selling to investors. And that's a pretty stark number. And that's the obvious one for me to say, why is there so much supply? Well, it's not because we built too much, because there's still a lot of population growth and demand in Sydney and the surrounding CBD area. What the issue was is that there was too much lending, or probably more so frivolous lending, to people who shouldn't have been lent to in the first place, but they were buying investment properties and ultimately adding more stock to the rental market, which has now led to a record low amount of actual yield on properties in Sydney, as well as one of the highest vacancy rates out of any of the cities in the country, which, you only look back 3 or 4 years ago and it was the lowest vacancy rate. We're sitting around about now 3% in Sydney, which we probably seeing we're somewhere in the next 4 to 6 months we'll find the absolute top. And because of the restrictions in lending, what this is now going to give all investors the opportunity to see over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, anyone who's holding property in Sydney, anyone who's holding property in Melbourne, holding it for that next 5 years, you will start to see rental growth. I can guarantee it. Don't quote me on that, but I would say that really one thing that I personally, holding a fair bit of property around the Sydney market, I'm expecting, I'm already probably starting to see certain signs of no investor activity. Not to say that's going to directly result in rentals going up, but we see that now there's natural push towards more people still wanting to live there, less properties on the rental market, and as that population growth continues to flow through, we're going to see rental growth. It's going to happen. So we're going to see a time where money's going to be cheap, rents are going to increase for the next 3 to 4 years, and we're going to see cash flows return to a much more equilibrium position. And it's going to be a good position for any investor to hold in any market, but in particular Sydney and Melbourne, where they need that cash flow, because yields, if you bought in the last 2 or 3 years, look pretty diabolical, and you're going to need that to make sure you hold on to it. So on the Sydney market, before we say where we expect markets to go and looking at the growth cycle, one aspect which I think is a little bit different to the GFC numbers from Melbourne, and looking at this here, is that it was pretty evenly spread across the board. Northern Beaches is a much smaller market as far as sheer volume of properties in that area. But right across the board on the GFC, and people thinking, well, geez, this is unprecedented. There were areas right across Sydney for about a 2-year period when we saw the GFC come through, where prices in some areas came back as much as 16%, all the way through to probably on average somewhere between 9 and 8%, or 8 and 12%, depending on where you're looking. And one thing I think is very obvious here is that it's a pretty even spread. And if you look at what's happening in the downturn right now in the Sydney market, the initial and the first 12 months, the areas that got most affected and saw the sharpest declines in value were the areas which were in excess of $1.7, $1.8 million in value. And we saw those areas were falling off a cliff at a rate not, and that came back down to that serviceability criteria changing for all households, and all of a sudden banks weren't lending the same amount of money, therefore people couldn't borrow the same amount, competition went away, and where there was 5 people in an auction, there was one. Where there was one, there's now none. Where it was an auction, is now going to be a private treaty, and that's usually going to be the common theme. We're starting to see some of those more affordable areas start to fall into the same wavelength now as well. And on average, when we look at, for instance, Bondi versus Campbelltown, and we looked at some of that data only a couple of days ago, they've both come off the boil around about 10 to 11% over the last 18 months. Now, anyone who says that the more affordable areas get hit the most first, look, it's a furphy, and I really get sick of people saying that just to fulfill their own unique prophecies. But if you look at areas right from the inner cities, which have got the $2-3 million plus ranges, right through to the areas of the more affordable belt, from Penrith right through to St Mary's, Mount Druitt, over towards Blacktown, Liverpool, out towards Campbelltown, in areas which have got very, very good long-term fundamentals, have got very strong population growth, multiple universities, largest hospitals in the country, and some big employment drivers over the next 5, 10, 15 years, they're going to be pretty affordable in the next 3 or 4 years. So if you are thinking about investing back in Sydney, similar to Melbourne, we probably see that the opportunity is still going to be a few years away. Wait till you see that rental increase and vacancy rates coming down. And we want to see those vacancy rates sitting below about 2.6, 2.5, 2.4% before you start to get excited, but also start to see rental growth, the value of rental growth. And the actual dollar value is very, very important. We want to see that not only for your own cash flow, but also to make sure that as you build a portfolio, they're the numbers that are going to allow you to hold it and sustain it and borrow again. Because the bank's going to look at those numbers and say, well, if it's costing you $5,000 a year to hold that property, and then they take into account only 80% of that total rent as your serviceability, plus they're now tacking on another $20,000 a year into what it costs for your household to run. And also now that's on top of that, let's say they're servicing you on 7.2% interest rate, even though you're only paying 4%. These are all things that are going to work against you. So making sure that the actual raw data and the figures that you're getting on your property is very, very important. Don't factor in depreciation or any negative gearing into those equations, because ultimately the banks don't care about it. And if that's what you're factoring in to hold a property and make it make sense, it's very dangerous territory in my opinion. So that's a walk through memory lane, and I hope that there's a fair bit that people took out of that, because I know there's a whole hunk of data that we've gone through and tried to drag and build a bit of a story and a narrative about it. What we're going to do now is probably just say, well, we've gone through what's happened and what is happening and what's happened long term, what's happened short term, what's happening right now, a bit about the population growth, a bit about the economic structure and story. What we're going to do is now quickly go through where we see the opportunities over the next 2 or 3 years, because one thing that I am positive of is that this is one of the best markets I've personally seen as a professional investor for a long time, to actually make the most out of a market that is very, very quiet compared to the last 7 to 10, and in some cases up to the last 15 to 20 years. The opportunity has not been great for us as investors to start to get very well-positioned, well-valued properties now, to make sure they're positioned for that growth that's going to come over the next 5, 10, 15 years and beyond. So we'll go through that data here. But one thing I'll just touch on, and this is a very good picture, I think, for everyone to get a hold of, is the national home price change over the last 17 years, give or take, has actually averaged out to be about 7.1% increase as of May last year. Now, as of the markets coming off, we probably say that number is probably more like 6.7-ish% average annual compounded growth. And this is really what people need to get their head around. Now, when we do modelling for clients when they come in, we don't necessarily even take into account anywhere near that 6%. We model off 4%, and we want to make sure we're very, very conservative. But this is 17 years going back data, and that's from a peak to a very, very sustained downturn in Sydney and Melbourne between about 2003 and 2008. And other markets have gone backwards, up and down and sideways, as you've seen in those graphs. But one thing that's been pretty consistent, if you average it out, the compounding growth effect has been anywhere between 6.5% and 7% year on year. If you held a property right at the peak of January 2002 in Sydney and still held it today, you would have got 7% compounded growth, give or take. That's a huge number. an absolute astronomical number. And ultimately, if you factor in around about 5% compounded growth year on year, it'll take you about 15 years for your properties to double in value. Now, that's a pretty conservative approach. Even if you take it into 4%, might take 17 to 18 years. For us, if you can afford to hold that property for a 17 to 18 year time frame and it costs you minimal to hold, and you can therefore leverage and buy another asset and go through that same process up to as many assets as you can leverage and comfortably hold, this is where that long-term wealth is created. It's not in those 2 or 3 year growth cycles. It's over that growth cycle, holding in that soft cycle, reinvesting at the point where there's good opportunities, which there are now, and then holding through that next growth cycle and continuing that process. So, national growth over the last 12 months. So let's go through this quickly before we see where there's opportunity over the next 2 and 3 years. As I said earlier, the market that's been a standout is Hobart, and that's been fantastic for anyone who's held there. I know we've got a lot of happy people who bought there 2 and 3 years ago. We don't necessarily see the same opportunities in Hobart over the next 2 or 3 years as we did in the previous 2 or 3. So that's probably for us a market which I would be avoiding unless there was a very, very good opportunity that came your way. The markets which you see there in blue, however, en masse, are probably the markets which are starting to show some opportunity. You'll notice there's a common theme between these, one of which is ACT. It's probably a market which is going to stay relatively balanced and bubble along quite nicely over that same time frame. Brisbane and West, and this is a more affordable corridor, is actually grown at over 3%. And this is from probably the entire market of Ipswich over towards parts of Darra and Springfield have actually grown quite well over that time. And it's probably more so been on the back of very strong population growth, very sustained jobs and economic position. And I think the long-term picture of that area is quite good. Areas that also you look in there which are quite similar is Adelaide and Brisbane, both in the east and west there. Moreton Bay, which is in the north of Brisbane. Adelaide Central and Hills, which is a little bit further down. Adelaide South, Moreton Bay South, which again is in north Brisbane, and Adelaide North. And there's a very common theme there to say that a strong part of the east, west and north of Brisbane is looking very, very attractive. Similar to Adelaide. Adelaide's probably more so a bit softer if we compare this with yields, a bit softer in the yields. And over the long term, hasn't necessarily shown those really exciting times in the market over a 10, 15 year period where it's actually grown more than that 2, 3, 4%. The areas which we've actually seen hurt, however, is what we've already outlined. Now, this is dominated ideally, well, obviously by predominantly Sydney at the moment, and that's right across the board. And we're starting to see there that Sydney Ryde area as an example, 13.3%. The average house price in Ryde, well over $1 million. Sydney inner southwest, another very, very exclusive market, well over $1 million, has dropped exponentially. Southern Shire, over close to 11%. Baulkham Hills, Hawkesbury, Sydney Parramatta. Melbourne inner south, an exclusive market. Sydney southwest is probably more of one of those middle belt and working middle class markets. Sydney Blacktown again, with Sydney inner west. Right across the board, is starting to see between that 8 and 13% is where those markets will decline. And again, we probably see that if you overlaid parts of Melbourne right across the board, they're probably slightly behind, but they're actually accelerating in their decline. So we're going to start seeing all hit about an equilibrium over the next probably 12, 24 months, is that holistically somewhere between 12 and 16%, in some cases up to 18% from peak to trough. And then probably somewhere in that time frame, as I was saying earlier, we're expecting about 2.5 years to find the actual trough of its growth cycle, and about the same time before it actually starts growing again. So that's the best part of 5 years between 2017 and let's call it 2021, 2022, which is where it's going to be opportunistic to buy. But there's still going to be opportunities probably over the next 1 2 years in each of those markets where you're going to see fire sales, a lot of off-market opportunities. The biggest issue is cash flow and rental growth. They're the two big issues that we want to see change, as opposed to trying to jump in there too soon and just trying to take advantage of what you see as an opportunistic market, where other markets are actually growing and growing at a rate or not. So for me, the opportunity is get into some external markets, borderless markets, and then also find an opportunity to come back in that 3 to 4 year time frame to jump back in the Sydney or Melbourne market if that is what you're trying to do. That's regardless of whether you're going to be an owner-occupier or an investor, in my opinion. I've got a couple of questions, guys, and I can see them here in the Q&A and more, and I'm going to come to those. So thanks for putting those through, guys. So leave those with me. We've only got a couple of slides left before we finish up, so I'll get to those very, very shortly. So on that note, where do we expect the markets to head in the coming 3 years? And I'm going to go through this now sequentially in each of the markets. So whilst we can't outline a full set of data that we've disseminated over this 4 to 6 month period, we've summarised it into some very distinct markets where we probably see in each major sector over the next 3 years as per these below numbers. And this is probably where we expect each of the major markets to trend or head over the next 3 years. And it probably gives you a bit of an idea as far as where we're seeing opportunity to invest, both for the short, medium and long term right now, based on what we've just gone through and also what we're seeing in the future. So Hobart, we're probably going to see that it's still a very affordable city on the most part. Certain areas are probably starting to see it get a bit toppy, but we probably see, if you compound the growth over the next 3 years, somewhere in that 3 to 6%, excluding rental income. Now, obviously, if you include rental income, that's probably going to look like more like 10 or probably like 12 to 16% over that same time frame. It's definitely not going to be the probably the 30 to 35% that we saw in the previous 3 years that we got the best part of as investors. And this is probably one of the reasons why we're not necessarily buying there anymore. Brisbane, compounded over that same time, we expect it to be very, very solid, and that's going to be in that 7 to 10%. 7 to 10%, you know, realistically, is only 2 to 4% per year compounded. It's not a huge number. It's just a bit better than inflation. But if we're holding that property and we're holding it with a decent yield, we're effectively being able to grab, you know, the best part, and I'll go through some examples shortly, the best part of $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 growth of a $400,000 property over a 3 year period. And it's really for us to say that it's a nice, sustained market with really good fundamentals, not just for the next 3 years, but over that long term as well. Adelaide, we probably see it somewhere in that same ballpark, maybe slightly less, and this is going to be suburb dependent. Some of the areas which I would avoid is probably further out towards those Elizabeth markets where we're seeing a lot of hurt in the actual the actual employment areas. And there's actually a lot of investor stock that was built and is also owned out there. So there's quite an issue with regards to an oversupply of rentals as opposed to not enough demand as owner occupiers. But we do see that it's going to be in certain areas very consistent as far as capital growth is concerned. The yield on average, though, is still probably going to be about 0.5% less than what we're seeing in Brisbane. So cash flow still going to be slightly less in that market, but nonetheless, some good growth data. Perth's going to be an interesting one, and this is probably a lot of anyone who's on the webinar from Perth, you'll like to see this, that you haven't seen growth numbers hit the headlines there for the best part of 5 years, and we do expect that Perth is going to show us some distinct signs of growth over the next 12, 24 and 36 months. And it's probably going to ramp up towards the back end. And some really good signs for us at the moment is that we're starting to see some very good rental growth opportunities that are coming. Now, it doesn't mean that they're showing a 6-7% rental yield in middle ring corridors, but they're coming down quite heavily on vacancy rates in certain areas. And we've got our eye on probably somewhere between 10 and 15 certain markets, which we're just starting to explore now. So if anyone is interested in those markets, definitely reach out to us because we've got a lot of opportunities. Also in parts of Brisbane and small parts of Adelaide, we're definitely exploring those markets as well. But Perth's going to be one that we see is going to turn a corner over the next 3 years, and we're going to see a nice steady compounded growth rate in those markets. Darwin, anyone who's got a property in Darwin and has bought it in the last 5 years, I want to say sorry, because I know no doubt you've obviously experienced a world of hurt in that market. It's probably somewhere between 20 and 25% off its peak of 2013-14. And the interesting thing about Darwin is it's actually still got the highest rental yield in the country, but the issue it has is that it just doesn't have the jobs creation. It had a bit of a supply boom where there was construction coming out of the ground on the back of the liquid natural gas markets and also a bit of the iron ore and supporting markets that were happening in there. But there's really not much that's supporting it at the moment, and there's too much supply and not enough population growth. 1 to 3% growth over that time, I think, might be a little bit generous. It may see negative growth still over the next 3 years. If anything, we're definitely not touching it at this stage. So I'll leave it at that to speak relatively nicely about it. Canberra, as I said, guys, is a market that's been a really steady performer, probably grown in the vicinity of 45 to 50% over the last 6-7 years, and has actually shown really low vacancy rates. So there's been sub 1.5% vacancy rates across most markets there, which has been very, very good for anyone holding it. The yields, however, have been a bit softer, probably more like that 4.4% for freestanding houses, and it's probably going to still hover around that. So to enter into that market into good quality corridors that are $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, you're still going to be taking a hit of somewhere between $3,000 and $8,000 a year conservatively to hold those equivalent properties. Probably more like that $5,000 to $8,000 a year conservatively. So you've got to make sure you take that into consideration if you are investing into that market. But we do see consistent growth. In all likelihood, Labor is going to get voted in, and historically Labor are very pro public sector work, and obviously there's a lot of additional supporting industries in that Canberra market for a lot of the contract work that goes through to supporting government at certain times, a lot of public sector work that's directly employed in Canberra as well. So we see that as a relatively steady sign in those markets. Nothing that's going to reflect boom times, but I think it's going to be steady. Vacancy rates will remain low. Rents will probably remain relatively steady, but I'd probably avoid the attached markets at this stage. Melbourne, we're probably going to see it over the next 3 years, as I was saying, probably somewhere between that 4 and 5 year peak, or probably peak to peak or growth to growth trough come into play. We probably see it's going to hover around about neutral over the next 2 to 3 years. And that's going to see it come off a bit and then come back up to around about a growth market somewhere around about that 3 year time frame. It might actually still be in the negative by that 3 years. Long and short of it is that cash flow is soft, as well as vacancy rates are okay, and they're probably going to get better over the next 1 and 2 years. But one thing's for sure is that we've probably got another 6 to 12 months for it to go sideways and down a bit before it finds a buying opportunity. Anyone who's cashed up and can afford a bit of a cash flow hit, there's going to be some great opportunities in the next 12 to 24 months, and very, very similar to Sydney. I personally have bought a couple of development sites in Sydney over the last few years. Seen some very good opportunities that come out of that. And even though these markets are declining, you can still find sites which definitely have the opportunity to get a very, very sound ROI, even factoring in further declines in markets. So the opportunities sit there. I'd say on whole as business, we're not necessarily purely focused in this market en masse just yet. And that's something that I do find is that it's probably going to be opportunity time the next 12, 24, 36 months. But one thing that is clear from this image that I can see in front of everyone now is that the opportunity is absolutely rife to take advantage of parts of Brisbane, in particular those infill areas with rezoning pockets, flood-free, easement-free, but still holding that 5, in some cases above 5% gross rental yield for future opportunities to maybe develop, whether it's a subdivision, whether it's higher density, whether you do nothing but trying to get access to properties which have got more opportunity in the actual intrinsic land. That's a big focus about what we do. And if anyone's interested in looking at those property types, feel free to reach out to us and we can walk through how we do it and what we do. Adelaide's going to be for us a little bit more about the middle tier markets and probably more of those owner-occupier markets. So again, softer cash flow in those markets. Growth will be solid and steady, but we see that the biggest beneficiaries are going to be the ones who are going to be taking advantage of those government sector contracts for the frigates and subs contracts, which are typically going to be the tertiary educated engineers and a lot of those project managers, those types of roles that sit around that. But we think that that's going to be more adapted to the middle ring market, which is going to be more owner-occupier centric. So cash flow is typically a little bit less, that $550,000 to $700,000 price bracket within about 14 to 5Ks of that market. They're going to be the markets which will probably do the best. However, you've got to be able to afford to hold them is the catch-22 there, unfortunately. And as I said already, Perth's probably a market which we see in that $320,000 to $500,000 price point over the next 6, 12, 18 months. We're starting to see some rental growth come back up. And we're also starting to see opportunities in the population growth and jobs creation. So anyone who's been thinking, oh, I want to get into that market, or I'd ideally see that there's opportunities there may be some times that are coming up right now. I can give you some instances of properties that we're buying as we speak in that market. So again, if that is of interest to you and you've already got exposure in some of these other markets, that might be something to consider at this point in time as well, because we see that the next 3 years are going to be quite opportunistic. Just a quick case study on how we see that would flow through. And if we looked at, I guess, a couple of major points that we want to have as take-homes for anyone who's on the webinar over the next 3 years, making sure, and you probably see a common theme, which is what I'm saying, is that if you're going to be investing for the long term, and most people are on those household incomes between 100 and 250 who are investing in property from a household income perspective, regardless of whether you're sitting right at the top or at the bottom, if you're wanting to build a larger portfolio, as serviceability calculations are really working against investors and are going to continue to do so, cash flow is absolutely paramount. Regardless of whether you can absorb a $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year hit, it is going to affect you much more than what it actually affects your bottom dollar as far as how it affects those serviceability calculators. So one thing I'd always say right now is it's extremely important to invest for capital growth and making sure there's a focus on cash flow. And to do that, the majority of people are going to have to be borderless investors. You cannot invest in parts of Sydney or parts of Melbourne to get both of those components. Parts of Canberra aren't necessarily going to provide it, and probably even at this stage, parts of Adelaide probably aren't going to provide it in the areas which we see opportunity. So you're going to have to invest for both and keep your eye on both, even if you know you can afford more. I'd say do not extend yourself to the top of your borrowing capacity, and ensure that your serviceability remains strong, and your equity and cash buffers are already set up, so you can allow yourself to look very attractive from the borrowing capacity, but also position yourself to be able to keep going and keep getting that momentum. Because what's going to happen not only in the next 3 years is also the fact that over the next 5 and 6 years, there's some massive opportunities that are going to come back into the major markets where there's going to be some really good growth opportunities, but you're going to need good cash flow. And you're also going to need to take advantage of those growth opportunities to ideally leverage some of that equity, take it back and reinvest it into the Sydney and Melbourne markets at the time where they're going to be opportunistic. And that's a big focus of what we're doing at the moment internally with our clients. And speaking personally, I'm gearing up to look at a commercial purchase very, very soon, but also looking at some different opportunities interstate, particularly in Perth, Brisbane, Adelaide, those markets which I personally am looking to get more exposure into. They're the markets which we see opportunities in over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 24 months. And I think if anyone's interested in that 250 upwards of potentially up towards $500,000 price points in particular, with the cash flow balance, potential for growth, also that development upside rezoning pockets, they're the ones which we see really distinct opportunities. And that's what we've got a distinct focus off, particularly off market. So continuing to leverage is going to be paramount. And property, in my opinion, has only ever made sense if you're leveraged in it. If you're going to buy in cash, realistically for me, you have to really be looking at a very, very secure lease over a long term that's going to give you a very, very good cash position, and ultimately not buying it for capital growth, you're really buying it for cash flow. And a lot of clients we work with in the commercial space are looking for those, and that's a completely different kettle of fish. But in the residential sector, probably, and also the commercial sector more predominantly, you're going to be borrowing. And leverage, and a case study here, at 90% LVR, if we're looking, for instance, in a Brisbane market at a $400,000 investment, that achieves 10% capital growth over the next 3 years. That's compounded, that's in total. And that equals to approximately $40,000 growth on that $400,000 property. You'd require a $60,000 deposit, which would cover your closing costs, your deposits, and everything else that goes with it. So you can think there that quite simply, your $60,000 either cash or equity going into that $400,000 investment has made you 40 grand, and that's a 70% return on your money. Now, you don't necessarily have to look at it in the sense that any other way is that you put 60 in, you get 40 out, and that's very, very conservative. And ideally, the way that we look at that is that you're also getting cash flow neutrality if you're buying the correct asset, is that that property really shouldn't cost you much at all to hold. So ultimately, this should be in some way, shape or form a pretty neutral hold with an upside for growth. And that's a very short period of time. We're talking 3 years. Ultimately, we're modeling over 10, 15, 20 years and beyond. But even in a short period of time frame, here's what can be achieved over the next 3 years. That's 40 grand. And for most people to save 40 grand over 3 years is an extra effort that this property will ideally do. And if you compound that further at that same growth rate over the next 20 years at about that 3% compounded growth, you're talking about 21 years, that $400,000 property is now worth $800,000. And if it's cash flow neutral, again, it's an asset which has not necessarily taken too much effort, cash, or a change in your lifestyle to be able to hold, re-leverage, build upon. So I think that's a bit of the word to the wise, guys, is invest for capital growth and cash flow, making sure the focus is on both of those. The majority of people, it's going to be borderless. And if you're not thinking borderless right now and you're thinking in your own backyard, you need to really make sure that you're looking at all the holistic data to take a clear helicopter view or helicopter picture of how the markets are performing and what's going to happen over the next 3, 5 and 7 years, because the chances are you buying 10 minutes from where you live is probably not going to be the best outcome for you financially. And making sure you continue to work very, very strongly with your broker. We don't do finance intentionally. We have plenty of finance brokers that we can refer clients to if you do look to wanting to get that discussion away. Make sure that you're working with someone who understands your clear picture and can look at how they can leverage correctly and also allow you to maximize your position. Before we get into the questions, guys, what I just wanted to quickly just make sure that everyone was aware of as well for us is that we've got a free offer for all of our webinar subscribers, and typically for our Blueprint Strategy sessions, we charge $990. We're offering that free as a giveaway to all of our webinar subscribers. There's a link here, which will be back into the follow-up email, which will come tomorrow. But if you subscribe or click on that link, it takes you directly to actually my calendar. You can jump onto that, book in. To get that deal, you actually have to make sure you reference back to the future webinar. And that's actually going to mean that there's a $990 deduction in our normal fee for a half an hour strategy and blueprint session with myself directly. So jump on that, make sure you take advantage of it. Write it down now if you do need to, because this is something we're not going to offer again on any other webinars. We'll also make sure that we're going to offer our top 50 suburbs guide under 500,000 with strong rental yield. We spent about a year putting that together. So if anyone hasn't downloaded that yet, make sure you jump on our website. You'll see top 50 guide, download that. And we'll also send it out to all of our webinar subscribers tomorrow in our link. But for me, that's the biggest giveaway I think I've ever personally put forward, is about $1,000 worth of what we normally charge as value is going to be free to anyone who does jump onto this and book in. We're about two weeks booked out in advance now, so you're going to have to be pretty quick to make sure you jump onto that over the next 4 weeks or so. But that's just to make sure that there is something that's very, very relevant and hopefully going to add a lot of value to any investor looking to plan out their strategy, looking at what they're going to buy next and how they're going to plan out not just their next purchase, but also the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years and beyond, and how to actually get a clear blueprint of how to get to that financial freedom that you're trying to achieve, and doing some modeling along the way so you can get a clear picture of how you're going to achieve that. I'm going to now, guys, very quickly, I want to get into, actually, I'll go back and leave it on that screen so people can write down that link if you do want to take advantage of that booking and that one-time offer. But I'm going to go to the Q&A, guys, and just go through these one at a time, if you don't mind. And we've got some Q&A here. We've got a comment from Tim Russell. I'm just going to read through these. Is that low interest rates resulting in increased borrowing capacity for consumers and overseas interest in the Australian property market have been the main drivers of the recent housing boom? And given that credit has now tightened, where do you see the opportunity for markets to grow in the short to medium term? And it's a brilliant question, Tim. And if anyone's on the webinar who wants to know a good broker, Tim Russell, I'm pretty sure it doesn't say it's the Tim Russell that I'm thinking of, but Tim Russell himself, I know, is a very, very diligent and excellent broker working in the investment space himself. Great question, Tim. And from that side of things, where we see opportunities, I think ultimately is going to be in those areas which are not just going to be driven by investor demand, and really comes back down to the fundamentals of where is the broader economy putting money for economic, fundamental long-term economic drivers, so jobs creation hubs, things like public hospitals, things like schools, universities, rail corridors, access to main amenities. Where are they going to be? Because ultimately that's where the owner-occupied demand is going to consistently be over the long term. As much as investors will come and go, we see that we want to focus on areas which are going to be there in the good times and the bad times, and hence why us avoiding areas that are going to be predominantly driven by tourism or mining really aren't fitting our MO or our narrative, because they are usually going to be driven by one driver and obviously by the free availability of credit over about a 4 or 5 year period to predominantly investors now drying up. We want to focus on areas which are going to have more demand and more focus on owner occupiers over the long term. I hope that answers your question there, Tim, and I'm sure, mate, that it's probably pretty aligned from your thinking as well. We've got Marcio has also got a question here, or a comment, 80% LVR. Can you comment on investing on positive versus negatively geared properties in Brisbane? And if we look at that, and going back to that example that I showed in this slide deck only probably 5 minutes back on a $400,000 property, I just did some modelling there from 90% LVR. Off an 80% LVR, approximately at $400,000 at 80% LVR, if you're getting about 5.5% gross rental yield at a $400,000 purchase, it's going to be about probably at about 4.5% principal and interest repayments. You're probably going to be about $2,500 to $3,000 a year negative, pre-tax deductions, etc. For most people, that's going to be an affordable position. If you're focusing on that, I would say that that's much more of a cash flow orientated position. But for me, it comes down to what is your personal savings position? What is your own earnings income potential? And what is your serviceability? What other debts do you have? And what are you saving per annum? For me, long term, I would love to see a property that does give that 5%. If I'm looking at building a portfolio, particularly in Brisbane as an example, and we've got $400,000 or $500,000 to spend with about an 80% LVR position, I would be wanting to focus on areas which are a backfill, definitely not new or off the plan, but ideally backfill with regards to being close proximity to hospitals, close proximity to rail and any other bigger infrastructure projects. But on top of that, really trying to get some focus on areas which have got some rezoning. So trying to buy in areas which are owner-occupied centric, which are still very, very attractive for renters because of the proximity, but have that attractive additional bonus or that X factor that you can turn those into a potential development site, or a developer wants to buy them off you later down the track. And that's the key for me, is that you don't have to go and build 10 units to be the person who's going to buy a property strategic and say, well, the only way I can maximise the profit here is to actually get the ability to find the finance to build these units. Ultimately, you're holding a key piece of real estate and the land is what's going to appreciate. So I would like to see that. I think a blend of positively geared, or not necessarily positively geared, but cash flow and focus on good quality capital growth, land grabbing assets is going to be my focus there, Marcia. Good question. Thanks for that one. Paul Griebel. G'day, Paul. Thanks for joining us, mate. Hi, Paul. Previous slide said Brisbane is close to the top. Not saying the buy at the top. So can you comment on why Brisbane is still an opportunity right now? That was probably written a little bit earlier in the piece. Look, we definitely don't see Brisbane right at the top right now. The graph that we showed with Brisbane, that was a point-to-point graph where we saw it was peak to trough, where it went actually backwards between 2010 and 2015. And that was actually the time where it went backwards. We see that it's only steadily, it's at the most expensive point it's been, but Brisbane is only effectively about 22, 24% more expensive than what it was in 2009. So factoring in inflation, we're about bang on inflation in Brisbane right now. If you factor in the last decade worth of capital growth and inflation being hovering around 2.2%, compounding that over that time, Brisbane is more or less exactly in line with inflation. So it hasn't grown outside of inflation in the last 10 years. The population growth in Brisbane itself is coming in at about 25,000 additional people into Brisbane per annum interstate, not necessarily factoring in overseas migration, but interstate. That is the highest level it's seen ever. So there's more people moving into Brisbane domestically than there ever has been. There hasn't necessarily been the same level of demand or building going on in the last 3 or 4 years back into the peaks where it was 2015, 16, where they had their actual explosion of apartments coming to fruition. More so in the owner-occupier freestanding markets, that's particularly where we still see some distinct opportunities. Over the next 2 or 3 years, we think it's going to be very steady, but over the next 5, 10, 15 years, as the economy starts to really kick in the gear, as well as a lot of these bigger infrastructure plans, we've got the second airport line coming live in the next couple of months, and we've also got much bigger infrastructure plans right across the board from north to central down to the east and the southwest over towards Ipswich. There is no shortage of large multi-billion-dollar infrastructure plans and also population growth numbers that are looking exponential in that market. So really quite keen on that market, not necessarily to say that it's at the top. We see that it's probably somewhere in that meaty curve of where the buying opportunity is. And cash flow is still very good in that market, which is obviously also a very good long-term holding capability. Michael also writes, g'day Michael, what's the best state area to invest now for maximum growth for the next 3 years? Full equity and purchase in Sydney? Good question. Very, very crystal ball question. I would say, personally speaking, it comes down to what you can afford. I know it's very, very boring, but if I'm looking at it in blocks of price points, if I put it to 300 to 450 price point, I'm going to say probably in that market, probably parts of Brisbane right now, both in the north and potentially parts of the west in larger blocks, are going to be good opportunities in that price bracket. If we go out to that 450 to 600 price point, I think parts of the east of Brisbane are looking very, very attractive. Also parts of the middle rings of Adelaide, if you can afford the negative cash flow in both Adelaide and Brisbane, are looking very good. And parts of Perth in that middle ring, I think over the next 3 years are going to look very attractive towards the back end of that 3 years as well. So they're probably the markets from that 300 to 650 price points, which we probably see the best opportunities. There are going to be opportunities in Canberra still that have come through. But I think previous to that slide that I showed earlier, we probably see that those parts of Brisbane, parts of Adelaide, parts of Perth are going to hover around probably the best opportunity times as far as capital growth, to then have the opportunity to drag out equity if possible at that time, and then bring that back to the more major markets when those markets are probably at the absolute opportunistic time as well. I hope that answers your question, Michael, and thanks for it, mate. Last question here on that note is from Ben. Ben, I know the focus was on capital growth, but Gold Coast is missing from most of these charts, yet its population is larger than Canberra, so fairly important. What's your point of view on the Gold Coast market? Look, I've got a feeling that Ben might own a property in the Gold Coast or think about buying a property in the Gold Coast. Biggest issue we have with the Gold Coast, Ben, is not now, but it's been forever, is that it has a very, very large ability to bring on supply when the demand's there. And if we look back over the last 3 years, and if anyone's been on the Gold Coast, or Ben, you're on the Gold Coast right now, there's no shortage of 5 or 6 particular multi-story, in excess of 60-level apartment blocks being constructed right now, which majority of them don't have any more than 20 or 25% pre-sales that have occurred. There is too much of an ability for supply to come to the Gold Coast market in any period of time because of their propensity to go up, as opposed to keep it constrained to certain sizes of that market. And that's a big fear for us as investors, is we want to have control. And when you can't control 300 units coming to the market next door at any stroke of a pen or period of time, for me, that's really quite a risky position to be in. Now, there's times of growth. Gold Coast has had a pretty good last run of the last 3, 4, 5, well, probably more 3 or 4 years, and it's coming towards the top end of that market. If I was to invest in the Gold Coast market, I prefer to be away from the Southport, Broadbeach areas, probably further over towards the Tweed, a bit further out towards Narangba, etc., in those areas which are owner-occupied predominantly, much more in that the freestanding housing markets, and ideally not in those newer estates, larger blocks of land, still on those major corridor arteries, but staying well away from those inner areas. Particularly though, look, we probably see that the supply is the biggest reason why we don't necessarily love that Gold Coast market over the long term, Ben. And that's probably having the ability to actually be able to control it is something that we like to have on average. So yeah, that's probably our main reason why, mate, is if we can't control the supply and it's essentially out of our sphere of what we can do, then that's really not something we like to be focused on. A couple of comments here. From Dom, thanks Paul for sharing your insights, enjoyed it. Joe Tucker, when you're talking about development subdivisions from Perth market, what do you see cash needed up front to do one of these? What sort of percentage return? Look, in the Perth market, ultimately, look, we try to, if you're doing active developments, let's say it's a $300,000 purchase, an active development, ultimately you're looking for a 15% ROI, usually a bare minimum, but it really comes down to what the development is, Joe. It's how long is a piece of string. Sorry to be a bit vague with that answer, but a development can mean a lot of things, but ultimately, if it's a 1 into 2 lot subdivision with a build on the back of it, let's say it's a $300,000 to $600,000 in, you buy for 300, you've got to put another 300 in. You'd like to make sure you're getting about 750 as a minimum out, and that's going to give you about that 15-ish% after costs. That would be about what I'd expect, but remembering that development isn't necessarily something you can borrow against most of the time. So you're going to need much, much more liquidity to be able to go into those developments, not just to buy the property, but then actually to hold and build that asset. Typically, banks aren't lending you a typical 80, 90% of that development cost. You're going to need a far more bigger wedge of capital to actually go in. So anyone who's looking at building a portfolio in the early stages, we're much bigger fans of looking at assets which can have something done to them over that 5, 10, 15-year period. However, it's probably more so to say that we want to accrue or acquire assets which have that ability down the track, and then you can lend your time and focus and cash to them as they mature in value, but making sure that the cash flow to hold them over that period of time remains really quite succinct. So that's really the key focus for us. I hope that helps. And we've got a couple more here, guys, before we close it up. Is this available afterwards to re-listen to the webinar? Yes, we'll send out a copy to this hopefully tomorrow to everyone, and you can also forward it on. Also, guys, one thing I would note though is that the link to the blueprint strategy session and the saving of $990 is only going to be available to listeners and people who go into the first webinar as of tonight. So that's not going to be available for the second time round. And Marcia says, thanks, Paul. Fantastic prezzo. And Joe Tucker says, what about a 1 into 2 subdivision? And then I obviously think I got to that straight away after it, so it says appreciated. And then everyone else is, I think, going down the path of saying, thanks, Paul, great info, and chat soon. So, guys, look, I think I'll wrap it up there. Again, thank you very, very much for taking the time out on a Thursday night. I hope this has worked out quite well for you. And look, feel free to jump on our Facebook, Instagram, etc., like us and follow us, because we always post a lot of this data, a lot of this information if you're not already there. One thing I would note, though, is that take advantage of this link to my strategy sessions, because this is something I'm going to close up very soon. If you haven't done so, jump on that link, book some time, make sure you reference back to the future webinar to redeem the offer. And we're going to be running a live event. So if anyone's got a pen and pad handy, we're going to be sending out invites very shortly. I'm going to go through a lot of this data, but I'm going to go through some more in-depth data. I'm going to have an accountant who's got a huge property portfolio himself and has actually been through about 30 years worth of different cycles right across the country, and a man who's probably got more information about property from buy and hold, tax strategies, etc., than anyone else I know. So running it on March 5th, just so everyone's aware, March 5th, at the Radisson Suites in the city, in Sydney. We're going to send out invites and dates for that. So sorry if you're interstate. We're going to try and get to Melbourne and potentially Brisbane sometime later this year, but that's going to come out very shortly. And in the meantime, guys, I've got a book coming out, so keep an eye out for that. We've got some TV coming up on the project and Channel 9, Channel 7 in the next few weeks and months. So we're going to be very, very busy and unfortunately or fortunately in your face a fair bit. But guys, I really hope you enjoyed that information and data, and feel free to reach out to us if you've got any further questions, and jump on that booking link and take advantage of what we can do and hopefully set up some time to execute your goals throughout this year and beyond. So have a great night. Thank you again, guys, and we'll no doubt catch up very, very soon. Cheers.